The wolf appeared at 2:17 in the morning, with blood on her muzzle and something in her eyes that made Sarah Mackenzie's breath catch. She stood 3 feet from the ranger station's front steps, a grey female, maybe 70 pounds, her coat silvered by the motion sensor light that had triggered when she crossed the perimeter. Sarah watched through the window, one hand already reaching for the tranquilizer kit mounted beside the door. In 11 years with the Forest Service, she'd treated dozens of injured animals, but wolves rarely came this close to human structures, not in Mount Hood National Forest, where their grandparents had been hunted to near extinction before the reintroduction programs began. The blood was fresh, dark streaks across the wolf's muzzle and down her chest. Sarah's mind ran through protocols: territorial fight, illegal trap, vehicle collision, all required immediate intervention. She grabbed the medical kit and her radio, then stopped. The wolf wasn't injured. Her gait was steady as she paced the station's entrance. No limping, no labored breathing. When she paused under the light, Sarah could see the blood, clearly smeared on her face, not dripping from a wound. The wolf's amber eyes tracked upward, locking on to Sarah's position at the window. And held. Sarah felt her legs go weak. Wolves don't maintain eye contact with humans. The literature was clear on this. Among wolves, a direct stare signals threat, dominance, challenge. Even hand-reared wolves break eye contact within seconds, but this one didn't. She stood absolutely still, gaze fixed on Sarah's face, and something in that look made Sarah's scientific training stutter to a halt. It wasn't aggression, it wasn't fear, it looked like pleading. The wolf broke away first, but not to flee. She wheeled toward the forest, trotted 20 yards down the trail that led into the dark timber, then stopped, turned back, looked at the station, at Sarah. Then she trotted back to the steps and repeated the motion. Forest, return, stare. Forest, return, stare. Sarah activated her radio. "This is Mackenzie at East Ridge Station. Anyone copy?" Static. She was 12 miles from the nearest outpost. Budget cuts had eliminated overnight staffing everywhere except the main hub, and the repeater tower on Barlow Ridge had been malfunctioning for 3 weeks. She tried twice more, got nothing but white noise, and set the radio down. When she looked up, the wolf was still there, still watching. Sarah had been stationed at East Ridge for 6 months, solo duty that she'd volunteered for after her divorce, seeking the kind of solitude that comes with 20-mile views and no cell service. She knew this forest, knew that the illegal trapping epidemic had exploded this season, with wire snares appearing along game trails despite increased patrols. Knew that 2 hikers had been airlifted out last month after stumbling into an unmarked trap line. Knew that wolves, just beginning to reclaim their ancestral territory here, were disappearing at rates no one could explain through natural mortality. She also knew that what she was watching shouldn't be possible. The wolf repeated the pattern. Forest, return, stare. Each cycle identical. On the 7th repetition, Sarah opened the door. Cold November air poured in, carrying the scent of Douglas fir and something else, something sharp and wrong that she couldn't place. The wolf didn't approach, didn't retreat. She held her ground at the base of the steps, and when Sarah took 1 step onto the porch, the animal's entire body shifted, not aggressive, not defensive, expectant. "What do you want?" Sarah heard herself whisper. The wolf turned and ran, not fleeing, leading. She stopped after 30 feet, looked back, and the moonlight caught her eyes in a flash of reflected green. Then she trotted deeper into the timber, paused again, and the message became unmistakable. "Follow me." Every regulation Sarah had memorized said no, never pursue large predators alone, never leave the station unmanned during posted hours. Never follow an animal exhibiting abnormal behavior into an uncontrolled environment after dark. But the blood, the eye contact, the 17 repetitions of a pattern that no wild wolf should know how to perform. Sarah grabbed her coat, her flashlight, her sidearm, left the door unlocked and the lights on, protocol violation, but if anyone came looking, they'd know she'd left in a hurry. She descended the steps and crossed the perimeter into forest that swallowed the ranger station's light within 20 paces. The wolf waited at the edge of visibility, a grey shape against black timber. When Sarah's flashlight beam found her, she turned and continued, and Sarah, against every rational thought, followed. The wolf moved through the forest like water through stone, silent, purposeful, taking a path Sarah couldn't see, but somehow felt. Every 50 yards she stopped and waited, her pale coat catching moonlight in fragments, making sure Sarah was still following. When Sarah stumbled over exposed roots, the wolf paused. When Sarah regained her footing, the wolf continued. 2 miles in, Sarah's scientific mind began cataloguing what she was witnessing. The wolf's behavior didn't match any documented pattern she knew. Wild wolves avoid humans. They don't seek contact, don't lead, don't demonstrate this kind of sustained, goal-oriented interaction with people they've never encountered before. Yet this one checked Sarah's position constantly, adjusting her pace when Sarah fell behind, waiting at every fork in the trail until Sarah caught up, then choosing a direction with what looked like absolute certainty. Everything inside Sarah screamed impossible. The blood bothered her. It wasn't wolf blood, she was sure of that now. The way it smeared across the animal's muzzle suggested contact, not injury. Sarah had seen enough predator kills to recognize the pattern. A wolf who'd fed on fresh prey shows blood around the mouth, yes, but also on the chest, the paws matted into the fur. This was different. This looked like the wolf had pressed her face against something bleeding, or someone. Sarah's throat tightened. The trapping operations they'd been tracking weren't just about pelts. 3 months ago, the regional office had briefed all Mount Hood Rangers on intelligence suggesting organized wildlife trafficking, live animals captured for exotic pet trade, private zoos, breeding operations across state lines. Wolves brought premium prices. So did their pups. If this wolf had encountered trappers... But that didn't explain why she'd come to the ranger station, why she'd sought out a human, why she'd waited through 17 cycles of the same pattern until Sarah understood. The forest thickened. Old-growth Douglas fir gave way to dense, second-growth hemlock, and the understory closed in. Sword ferns and salal forming walls on both sides of what was barely a game trail now. Sarah's flashlight beam picked out broken branches where something large had pushed through recently. The wolf's path was deliberate, cutting through the heaviest cover as if she knew exactly where obstacles could be navigated. Sarah checked her GPS. They were 4 miles from the station now, heading northeast into a section of the forest she'd only patrolled once, remote, roadless, the kind of terrain that attracted people who didn't want to be found. The wolf stopped. She stood completely still, head turned back toward Sarah, and for the first time since leaving the station, she vocalized, not a howl, a whine, high-pitched, almost keening. The sound sent ice down Sarah's spine. Then the wolf did something that made Sarah's breath stop entirely. She sat like a trained dog, haunches on the ground, tail curled, front legs straight, waiting. The posture wasn't submission, it was communication. Sarah had seen working dogs do this when they'd completed a task and were waiting for their handler's next command. But this was a wild wolf. Wild wolves don't sit on command. They don't demonstrate trained behaviors. They don't understand human social cues that way. "Show me," Sarah whispered, not knowing why she said it. The wolf rose and moved forward another 100 yards, then stopped at the edge of a small clearing. The moonlight broke through the canopy here, illuminating something that made Sarah's heart drop like a stone. A camp. Rough, temporary, 2 tents, a vehicle parked in the trees, equipment scattered near a cold fire pit, and 3 men lying motionless on the ground. Sarah's hand went to her sidearm. Her flashlight swept the scene, looking for threats, for movement, for anything that would explain what she was seeing. No one stirred. The wolf stood at the clearing's edge, 20 feet from the nearest body, and watched Sarah. Waited. Her message delivered. Sarah approached slowly, every nerve screaming caution. The first man lay on his back, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, unconscious, not dead. The second man was curled on his side near the fire pit, also breathing. The third sprawled half out of a tent, one arm extended toward a portable propane heater that hissed quietly in the darkness. Sarah smelled it then, the sharp, wrong scent she'd caught at the ranger station. Propane. Too much propane. The heater's valve was stuck open, and the tent's ventilation flaps were sealed shut against the November cold. Carbon monoxide poisoning. These men would have been dead by sunrise. The wolf had saved them. Sarah shut off the heater with shaking hands, then dragged the first man 20 feet from the tent into clean air. His pulse was weak but steady. She repeated the process with the second, then the third, arranging them in the recovery position her wilderness first aid training had drilled into muscle memory. All 3 were breathing better within minutes, but none regained consciousness. She tried her radio again, still nothing. They were too deep, too far from any repeater. She'd have to hike back to the station to call for medical evacuation, and that meant leaving these men alone for at least 2 hours. The wolf hadn't moved. She sat at the clearing's edge, exactly where she'd stopped, when Sarah arrived, watching everything with an intensity that made Sarah's skin prickle. In 11 years of wildlife work, Sarah had never seen a predator behave this way. Wolves flee human presence. They don't linger, they don't observe, they especially don't remain calm and stationary near unconscious humans who would wake confused, possibly violent, definitely terrified. Sarah stood slowly, keeping her flashlight aimed at the ground to avoid startling the animal. "I need to get help," she said softly, knowing it was absurd to speak to a wild wolf, unable to stop herself. "They'll die without medical care." The wolf's ears swiveled forward. She rose to her feet, took 3 steps toward Sarah, then stopped and looked past her, into the trees beyond the camp. That's when Sarah saw the cages. They were stacked against a rock outcropping 30 yards from the tents, covered with a canvas tarp that had partially come loose. Sarah approached, her flashlight beam catching chain link and metal frames. 6 cages total. 5 were empty, their doors hanging open. The 6th was occupied. A male wolf lay inside, larger than the female, his breathing labored. Blood matted the fur on his shoulder where the cage's sharp edge had cut into him. And pressed against the back corner, barely visible in the darkness, were 2 small shapes. Pups. 6, maybe 7 weeks old. Sarah's hands went numb. The female wolf moved closer now, abandoning her position at the clearing's edge. She approached the cage with low, careful steps, then pressed her muzzle against the chain link. The male inside lifted his head slightly. One of the pups whimpered. Understanding crashed through Sarah like cold water. This wasn't a random wolf seeking help for random humans. This was a mother who'd found her family caged by trappers, assessed the situation, and made a decision that should have been cognitively impossible. The trappers were dying from their own mistake. The wolf couldn't open the cage herself, but she somehow knew that humans could. That the people in uniforms who drove marked vehicles and maintained the ranger stations were different from the people who set traps. So she'd run 4 miles to the nearest station, marked her face with blood from the trapped male to show urgency, and performed a pattern of behavior meant to communicate one thing: follow me. Sarah felt her scientific understanding of animal cognition shatter into pieces. Wolves don't plan that way. They don't assess multiple variables, threat level, territorial distance, human social structures, and formulate a multi-step strategy. They don't demonstrate that kind of impulse control, choosing to save their enemies in order to save their family. They don't understand that uniforms signify authority, but she had. Sarah's hands shook as she examined the cage lock. Industrial padlock, key-operated. She scanned the camp, searching through scattered equipment until she found a ring of keys clipped to one of the men's belt loops. She unclipped them carefully, returned to the cage, and tried 3 keys before one turned. The male wolf's eyes tracked her movements. She expected aggression, fear, a lunge at the opening door. Instead, he remained still, as if he understood that this human was different from the ones who'd caged him. Sarah swung the door open and stepped back quickly. The male didn't move. The pups huddled closer together. The female wolf waited, her entire body tense with something Sarah could only describe as hope. "Go," Sarah whispered. "You're free. Go." The male struggled to his feet. Blood dripped from his shoulder wound, but he nosed the pups forward gently. They emerged from the cage on unsteady legs, their eyes barely open, stumbling into the moonlight. The female approached them finally, touching her muzzle to each pup, then to her mate. The family reunion lasted 30 seconds of absolute silence. Then the female turned and looked at Sarah one last time. The eye contact held for 5 heartbeats. And in that moment, Sarah understood she was witnessing something no textbook had prepared her for. The wolf family didn't flee immediately. The male was weak, his movements careful and pained. The pups couldn't navigate more than a few steps without tumbling over their own feet. The female positioned herself between her family and Sarah, but her posture wasn't defensive. It was something else, watchful, waiting as if she was deciding whether to trust what had just happened. Sarah backed away slowly, giving them space. Her mind raced through protocols that had never anticipated this situation. 3 unconscious poachers. Evidence of federal wildlife trafficking crimes, a wolf family that should be examined by a veterinarian but couldn't be approached without tranquilization, and a female wolf who had just demonstrated cognitive abilities that would be dismissed as anthropomorphism if Sarah tried to report them accurately. This couldn't be, but she was watching it happen. She needed to document everything. Sarah pulled out her phone. No signal lay this deep in the forest, but the camera still worked. She took photographs of the cages, the camp setup, the equipment scattered near the fire pit. When she turned the camera toward the wolf family, the female stiffened. Sarah lowered the phone immediately. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I won't." The female's posture relaxed slightly. For 10 minutes, neither human nor wolf moved. The male groomed the pups with slow, deliberate licks. The female kept her eyes on Sarah, not with threat, but with an awareness that felt disturbingly human. Sarah had read the literature on wolf cognition. They were problem solvers, capable of cause and effect reasoning superior to dogs in some contexts. But this was different. This required abstract thinking. This required understanding that humans have hierarchies, that certain humans represent help rather than harm, that a 4-mile journey to a specific structure would result in rescue. No researcher had documented anything like it. One of the unconscious men groaned. Sarah turned sharply, her hand instinctively moving to her sidearm. The man nearest to her, late 40s, beard, canvas jacket, shifted, but didn't wake. His breathing was stronger now, more regular. They'd all survive if she could get medical help within the next few hours. When she looked back, the Wolf family was gone. Vanished into the forest as silently as they'd come, leaving only trampled grass where they'd stood and a smear of blood on the cage's chain link. Sarah felt an unexpected hollow ache in her chest. She wanted to see them again. Wanted to understand how the female had made her decision, what had happened in that wolf's mind during the moment she chose to seek human help instead of abandoning her family or attacking the trappers herself. Sarah forced herself to focus. She searched the camp methodically, cataloguing evidence. The cages were custom-built for transport, collapsible, with ventilation holes and water troughs, professional equipment, expensive. Inside one of the tents, she found paperwork, shipping manifests, contact information for buyers in 3 states, bank records showing transactions in the tens of thousands of dollars. This wasn't opportunistic poaching. This was organized crime. The portable heater that had nearly killed them sat silent now, its malfunction obvious once Sarah examined it closely. The valve connection had corroded, probably from moisture, causing gas to leak, continuously once ignited. The men had sealed the tent against the cold November night and condemned themselves. They'd have been dead in another hour, maybe less. The wolf could have left them that way, should have left them that way, by any evolutionary logic Sarah understood. These were the men who'd caged her mate, stolen her pups, wounded her family. Every survival instinct should have driven her to flee or to wait until they died and the cage lock became irrelevant. Instead, she'd run 4 miles in the dark, found the one human structure that represented authority, and performed a communication dance until that human understood and followed. Sarah sank down onto a fallen log, suddenly exhausted. Her legs felt weak, her thoughts scattered. She'd spent 11 years studying wildlife behavior, reading journals, attending conferences, learning the boundaries of what animals could and couldn't do. And in one night, a 70-pound grey wolf had shattered every boundary Sarah thought existed. The forest around her was silent, except for wind moving through hemlock branches. No howls, no rustling in the undergrowth. The wolf family had truly gone, leaving Sarah alone with 3 unconscious criminals and a story she wasn't sure anyone would believe. She checked her watch, 4:37 in the morning. Dawn was still 2 hours away. She needed to hike back to the station, call for backup, guide the medical team and law enforcement to this location. But for just a moment, Sarah sat in the darkness and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd witnessed. Awe, terror, disbelief, gratitude, all at once, until she couldn't tell them apart. Sarah hiked back to the station as the forest slowly turned from black to grey. Her flashlight battery was dying, but she barely needed it. Muscle memory and the growing pre-dawn light were enough to guide her feet along the trail. Every 50 yards she found herself looking back, half expecting to see a grey shape following, but the forest remained empty. By the time she reached the station, the eastern sky was bleeding pale orange. She radioed for help immediately, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. Within 90 minutes, 2 helicopters had landed in the clearing she'd marked on GPS, 1 medical evacuation team, 1 law enforcement unit from the regional office. Special Agent Tom Morrison took her statement, while paramedics worked on the 3 men. He was mid-50s, weathered, the kind of agent who'd seen enough wildlife crime that nothing surprised him anymore. But when Sarah described the wolf's behavior, His pen stopped moving. "Say that again," he said carefully. "The wolf led me to them," Sarah repeated. 4 miles through the forest, she performed a pattern at the station, running toward the trees, coming back, making eye contact 17 times. When I followed, she guided me directly to the camp. Morrison studied her face. "Wolves don't do that."
"I know. You're saying this animal sought you out specifically, communicated intent, waited for you to understand, then led you to the exact location where her family was caged. Yes? And the men were dying from carbon monoxide poisoning. They would have been dead by sunrise," Sarah said. "The wolf saved them to save her family." Morrison set down his pen. "I need you to understand what you're saying. You're describing theory of mind, abstract reasoning, understanding of human social structures, multi-step problem solving across species barriers. That's not how wolves think." "I know what I saw," Sarah said quietly. The evidence backed her up. The cages. The blood on the female wolf's muzzle matching the injured male's wounds. The timeline that put the wolf at Sarah's station exactly when the men's oxygen would have been critically depleted. The complete absence of any other explanation for why Sarah Mackenzie had left her post in the middle of the night and hiked 4 miles into remote forest to stumble upon an active wildlife trafficking operation. By noon, all 3 men were conscious and in custody. By evening, the story had spread through every ranger station in the Mount Hood network. By the following week, Sarah had been interviewed by wildlife biologists from Oregon State University, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and 2 documentary film crews. None of them could explain it. Dr. Rachel Kim, a wolf behavior specialist who'd studied Yellowstone packs for 20 years, sat across from Sarah in the ranger station 3 days after the incident. "I've documented tool use in wolves," she said slowly. "Cooperative hunting strategies that suggest sophisticated communication, problem solving that rivals primates in some contexts. But this..." She shook her head. "This requires understanding that humans in uniforms are different from humans who set traps, that ranger stations represent authority, that seeking help from a traditional predator species might result in a positive outcome. I don't know how to fit that into our current models of wolf cognition." "So I imagined it?" Sarah asked. "No." Dr. Kim pulled out her tablet, showing Sarah a grainy photograph taken by a trail camera 2 miles from the ranger station. Time stamped at 1:47 a.m. on the night in question. A grey wolf, female, moving at a lope toward the camera. She was coming from the direction of the trafficking camp. This puts her on a direct path to your station, so the physical evidence supports your account. I just can't explain the cognitive process that would make it possible." Sarah looked at the photograph for a long time. The wolf's eyes caught the camera's flash, reflecting back as pale green discs. Her mouth was slightly open, tongue visible, and on her muzzle, even in the low-resolution image, dark stains were visible. Blood. Evidence. Intent. "She knew what she was doing," Sarah said softly. "I saw it in her eyes. She wasn't acting on instinct. She was making a choice." Dr. Kim nodded slowly. "If you're right, and I'm not saying you're wrong, then we've fundamentally misunderstood something about wolf intelligence, about their capacity for abstract thought, about their ability to assess human behavior and adapt their own behavior in response. The scientific literature never mentioned this because it had never been documented until now." Sarah pulled up the photographs on her own phone, the cages, the camp, the evidence of a wolf family that had been stolen and then freed by the most unlikely rescuer imaginable. She scrolled to the last image, taken just before the family disappeared. The female wolf turned toward the camera, her eyes reflecting moonlight. looking directly at Sarah with an expression that Sarah would never be able to describe in any language that made scientific sense. It looked like gratitude. If your heart is racing right now, you understand, subscribe to the channel. Real stories are told here. The wolf family was never found. For 3 weeks after the incident, Sarah hiked every trail within 10 miles of the trafficking camp, searching for tracks, scat, any sign that they'd survived. Trail cameras captured deer, elk, black bears, even a wolverine moving through the high country. But no wolves. Dr. Kim's research team deployed acoustic monitors to pick up howls. Nothing. It was as if the family had vanished completely, melted back into the forest like smoke. Sarah told herself this was normal. Wild wolves are cryptic, elusive, nearly invisible, even in territories where they're known to den. Their absence didn't mean death. It meant they were doing what wolves do, surviving unseen, avoiding human contact, living in the spaces between our awareness and their reality. But she worried about the male's shoulder wound, worried about pups that young navigating a forest full of predators and early winter storms, worried most of all about the female who had demonstrated such extraordinary intelligence that Sarah couldn't stop wondering what other capacities remained hidden in that animal's mind. The trafficking case made national news. The 3 men, brothers from Idaho with a network spanning 6 states, faced federal charges carrying sentences up to 15 years. Their buyer list included private collectors, roadside zoos, even a breeding facility that sold wolf-dog hybrids for $20,000 each. The investigation expanded, triggering arrests in Montana, Wyoming, and Washington. It was, according to Agent Morrison, the largest illegal wolf trade bust in the Pacific Northwest's history. And it had only happened because one wolf made an impossible choice. Sarah kept working her regular shifts at East Ridge Station, but something had changed. She found herself watching the forest differently now, wondering what intelligence moved through those trees, what decisions were being made by minds she'd been trained to think of as
driven purely by instinct and survival. The scientific framework she'd relied on for her entire career felt suddenly inadequate, like trying to describe color to someone who'd never seen. 6 weeks after the rescue, Sarah was conducting a routine patrol when she found wolf tracks in fresh snow near Barlow Ridge. Large prints, male probably, and smaller ones alongside, pup-sized but bigger than they'd been in November. Growing. Her heart hammered. She followed the tracks for 2 miles, up through old-growth timber, to a rocky outcrop that overlooked 3 valleys. The tracks circled the outcrop twice, then disappeared into a dense thicket of mountain hemlock where Sarah couldn't follow without disturbing potential den sites. But on the rock face, where the tracks had paused, Sarah found something else. Fur. Grey, caught on a sharp edge of basalt. She collected it carefully, sealed it in an evidence bag, and sent it to Dr. Kim's lab for analysis. The DNA results came back in 10 days. Female wolf. Genetic markers consistent with the reintroduced Mount Hood population. No match in the federal database, which meant this wolf had never been collared or sampled before the trafficking incident. It was her. Sarah returned to the outcrop 3 times over the following month, always alone, always at dawn. She never saw the wolf, but the tracks appeared regularly, and twice she found evidence of successful hunts, deer hair and bone fragments scattered near the thicket entrance. The family was not just surviving, they were thriving. On her 4th visit, Sarah brought something with her, a small plastic container, the kind used for trail mix, filled with dried venison from her own freezer. She left it on the flat rock where the fur had been caught, wedged into a crevice where ravens couldn't steal it. She had no idea if wolves would recognize human food as safe. No idea if the female would even return to this spot. But she needed to do something. needed to acknowledge what had passed between them that November night in ways that went beyond scientific papers and law enforcement reports. The next morning, the container was empty. Something had eaten every piece. The container itself was undisturbed, not torn or scattered the way a bear or coyote would have left it. Removed carefully, almost deliberately. Sarah stood on the outcrop as sunrise broke over Mount Hood's white peak, and for the first time since the incident, she let herself cry. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming recognition that she'd been touched by something vast and inexplicable, something that lived outside the boundaries of human understanding, but occasionally, impossibly, reached across those boundaries to connect. The forest stretched out below her, endless and green and full of mysteries that no amount of study would ever fully reveal. Somewhere in that wilderness, a wolf family was alive because their mother had chosen to believe in the possibility of human compassion. And Sarah would spend the rest of her life trying to be worthy of that trust. Winter deepened across Mount Hood, and with it came a question Sarah couldn't escape. How had the wolf known? She spent her evenings in the ranger station reviewing everything she understood about wolf cognition, reading studies she'd skimmed in graduate school, reaching out to researchers across the country. The answers she found only deepened the mystery. Wolves possess remarkable intelligence. They solve complex problems, cooperate in sophisticated hunts, even demonstrate what some scientists call perspective-taking when coordinating pack movements. But nothing in the literature described the chain of reasoning that November Night would have required. The wolf would have needed to understand that ranger stations represented human authority, that the person inside was different from the people who'd caged her family, that leading this specific human back to the camp would result in the cages being opened, that saving her enemies was the only path to saving her family. Each step in that chain was cognitively complex. Together they suggested a level of abstract reasoning that shouldn't exist in wild wolves. Dr. Kim visited again in late January, bringing preliminary findings from a paper she was co-authoring about the incident. They sat in the station's small office while snow fell outside, covering the forest in silence. "I've interviewed everyone who's worked this territory for the past decade," Dr. Kim said. "Rangers, biologists, trail maintenance crews. And I found something interesting." She pulled out a map, marked with colored pins. 5 years ago, this area had a major wildfire. Evacuation orders went out. Rangers went door to door to remote cabins, used loudspeakers, drove marked vehicles through every access road, warning people to leave. Sarah studied the map. The burn zone overlapped almost perfectly with the territory where the trafficking camp had been located. "Wolves have generational memory," Dr. Kim continued. "They pass knowledge through observation, teaching behaviors that persist across multiple generations. If a wolf pack was in this territory during the evacuation, if they saw rangers helping, guiding, protecting, that information might have been retained, encoded somehow in the pack's collective behavior." "You're saying she learned that rangers are safe?" Sarah asked. "I'm saying it's possible. Wolves in Yellowstone have learned to distinguish researchers from hunters based on vehicle types. Urban wolves in Europe have learned to use crosswalks. They're capable of sophisticated observational learning that we're only beginning to document." Dr. Kim paused. "But even that doesn't fully explain what happened, because she didn't just recognize you as safe, she communicated. She performed a behavior pattern designed to convey information across species." Something in Sarah shifted that day. She'd been thinking about the incident as an anomaly, a singular moment of impossible connection. But what if it wasn't singular? What if wolves, all wolves, possessed this capacity, and humans had simply never created the conditions where it could be expressed? What if the boundaries Sarah had been taught were solid, were actually permeable, waiting only for the right circumstances to dissolve. That night, she hiked to the outcrop again. The moon was nearly full, turning the snow-covered forest into a landscape of silver and shadow. She sat on the flat rock where she'd left the venison, where the wolf's fur had caught on basalt, and she waited. No wolves came. But sitting there in the silence, Sarah felt something she couldn't name. A presence? Maybe. Or just an awareness that the forest was watching. That intelligence moved through these trees in forms that walked on 4 legs instead of 2, that communicated through scent and posture and sounds humans barely registered, that made decisions based on calculations no algorithm could capture. She thought about the 17 repetitions at the ranger station, the patience that required, the hope. The wolf had performed that pattern again and again, believing, or maybe just desperately wishing, that the human watching would understand. And Sarah had understood, not through training or protocol or scientific knowledge, through something older, something that existed before humans invented language to describe it, a recognition that passed between 2 species in a moment of shared need, saying, "I see you, I trust you, help me." When Sarah hiked back down to the station 2 hours later, her radio crackled to life. Base calling with a routine check-in, nothing urgent. She responded automatically, but her mind was still on the outcrop, still sitting in moonlight with the knowledge that everything she thought she understood about the boundary between human and animal intelligence was wrong. Not wrong, maybe. Just incomplete. The wolves knew something humans had forgotten. Something about connection, trust, and the courage it takes to ask for help across every divide that says you shouldn't. The female wolf had remembered, had chosen to believe, had saved everyone, including herself, because of it. And somewhere in the forest her pups were learning that same courage. Spring came late to Mount Hood that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the forest into something almost unrecognizable. Snowmelt turned every creek into a torrent. Wildflowers erupted across the meadows. And with the warming weather came increased foot traffic. Hikers, campers, climbers eager to explore trails that had been buried under snow for months. Sarah was conducting a backcountry patrol in early May when her radio crackled with an emergency call. 2 hikers reported hearing what sounded like an animal in distress near Umbrella Falls, about 3 miles from her current position. Possible poaching incident. Rangers requested to investigate immediately. She reached the location in 40 minutes, following the established trail until she heard it. Not distress exactly, but vocalization. Wolf howls, multiple animals, coming from somewhere west of the falls where the terrain dropped into a steep ravine. Sarah approached carefully, following protocols she'd refined over 11 years. Stay downwind, move slowly, assess the situation before intervening. Through her binoculars, she scanned the ravine and felt her breath catch. The wolf family. She recognized the female immediately, the silver-grey coat, the distinctive gait, the way she held her head, slightly cocked, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. The male was there too, his shoulder wound, long-heeled, moving with strength and confidence. And around them 4 adolescent pups, gangly, playful, testing boundaries and learning pack hierarchy through mock battles and submission displays. They were magnificent. But something was wrong. The female kept circling back to one spot at the ravine's edge, nosing at something Sarah couldn't see from her vantage point. The male joined her, and their vocalizations increased, sharp, urgent barks that carried across the distance. Sarah moved closer, using the dense underbrush for cover. When she reached an outcrop with a clear view, she saw what had them agitated: a fifth pup, smaller than the others, trapped on a narrow ledge 15 feet below the ravine's rim. The earth had given way beneath it, fresh soil and rocks still tumbling down the slope. The pup cried out, a high-pitched whine that tore at Sarah's chest. It couldn't climb back up. The drop below was another 30 feet onto jagged rocks. The female paced the edge, looking down at her stranded offspring, then out toward the forest, then back to the pup. Sarah watched the wolf's body language shift through calculations. Could she reach it? Could the male? Could the other pups help somehow? Every option was tested and abandoned. The ledge was crumbling. Sarah could see dirt falling away with each movement the trapped pup made. Minutes, maybe, not hours. Then the female stopped pacing. She turned her head slowly, scanning the forest in a deliberate arc, and her eyes locked onto Sarah's position in the underbrush. Every hair on Sarah's body stood up. She hadn't made a sound, hadn't moved, was downwind. There was no way the wolf should have known she was there. But those amber eyes found her instantly, with precision that felt impossible, and held her gaze with an intensity that made Sarah's heart hammer against her ribs. In that moment, species didn't matter. The female wolf's message was as clear as spoken language. "You're here. You can help. Please." Sarah stood slowly, making herself visible. The male wolf tensed immediately, moving between Sarah and the 4 healthy pups. But the female didn't retreat. She stood at the ravine's edge, looking from Sarah to the trapped pup and back again, waiting. "I see her," Sarah said quietly, knowing it was absurd, unable to stop. "I see her. Let me help." She assessed the situation with her rescue training. The ledge was accessible, barely, if Sarah used climbing rope to rappel down. She had a 50-foot line in her pack, standard equipment for backcountry patrols. The anchor points were solid, 2 mature hemlocks with good root systems. She could reach the pup, secure it somehow, bring it up. But she'd be putting herself between a wolf pack and their endangered offspring. Every regulation she knew said call for backup. Don't engage with wild predators. Let wildlife services handle it. The ledge crumbled another inch. The pup's cry pierced the air. Sarah pulled out her rope. She worked quickly, tying off to the hemlocks, testing her anchor, clipping into her harness. The wolf family watched every movement. The male remained tense, protective. The 4 healthy pups had gone completely silent, as if sensing the gravity of what was happening. And the female stood absolutely still, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Sarah backed over the edge and began her descent. The trapped pup saw her coming and panicked, scrambling backward. The ledge crumbled further. "Easy," Sarah whispered. "Easy, I've got you." She reached the ledge, and just as another chunk broke away, her gloved hands closed around the pup's scruff, the way a mother wolf would carry her young, and she pulled the small body against her chest. The pup was surprisingly light, maybe 25 pounds, all fur and bone and terrified heartbeat. Sarah secured it inside her jacket, zipping it closed so only its head protruded, then began the climb back up. Her muscles burned, the pup squirmed. Above, she could hear the female wolf making sounds Sarah had never heard before, something between a whine and a bark, urgent and desperate and hopeful all at once. Sarah's hands reached the rim. She pulled herself over the edge and lay on solid ground for 3 seconds, catching her breath. Then she unzipped her jacket carefully. The pup tumbled out, disoriented but uninjured. It took 2 wobbling steps toward its mother, and the female wolf approached Sarah, slowly, deliberately, close enough that Sarah could have reached out and touched her. Their eyes met. The wolf's gaze held nothing but recognition, deep, profound, impossible recognition. And then she turned, nuzzled her rescued pup, and guided her entire family into the forest. Sarah watched them disappear into the hemlock shadows, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and awe, and something that felt like witnessing a miracle you'd been told couldn't exist. The forest fell silent. And Sarah understood, finally, that some connections transcend every boundary we build to keep the world comprehensible. Sarah never saw the wolf family again after that day in May. She hiked to the outcrop every week through summer and into fall, leaving offerings she knew were unnecessary: dried meat, bits of salmon, once a worn work glove she thought might carry her scent. The gifts were never taken. The tracks she found belonged to other animals: black bears, mountain lions, the resident elk herd. It was as if the family had fulfilled whatever contract existed between them and moved on to territory where humans couldn't follow. Dr. Kim's paper was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management in September, titled Evidence of Cross-Species Communication in Grey Wolf Canis lupus, a case study. It documented the November incident with scientific precision, but stopped short of making claims the peer review process wouldn't accept. The conclusion was carefully worded. Further research needed to understand the cognitive mechanisms underlying observed behavior. But in the acknowledgement section, Dr. Kim had written something that made Sarah's throat tight. To Ranger Sarah Mackenzie, who had the courage to follow. The trafficking case went to trial in October. All three brothers accepted plea deals: 12 years federal prison, lifetime ban on wildlife permits, $2 million in restitution to wolf conservation programs. Agent Morrison told Sarah it was one of the most satisfying convictions of his career. "You broke open something big," he said. "Networks we didn't even know existed." Sarah nodded, accepted his gratitude, and didn't tell him that she wasn't thinking about the conviction. She was thinking about a wolf who'd saved the men who'd caged her family, because the calculus of survival sometimes means protecting your enemies to save the ones you love. In November, exactly 1 year after the incident, Sarah requested a transfer. Not away from Mount Hood, toward it. She took a position as the senior ranger for the forest's wolf recovery program, a role that had been created specifically to monitor and protect the slowly growing population. Her first day, she was given access to all the trail camera data from the past 5 years. She spent 3 days reviewing thousands of images: deer at salt licks, bears fishing in streams, hikers posing for summit photos. And then, on a camera positioned near Umbrella Falls, dated 2 weeks after the pup rescue, the wolf family, all 6 of them, healthy, together. The female in the lead, the male guarding the rear, 4 adolescent pups between them, moving with the coordinated grace of animals learning to hunt as a pack. The image was grainy, backlit by sunset, but Sarah could make out every detail that mattered. She printed the photograph and pinned it above her desk at the new office. Visitors always asked about it. "That's a beautiful shot," they'd say. "Where was it taken?" And Sarah would tell them the whole story. Not the sanitized version from Dr. Kim's paper or the news reports that had made her briefly famous. The real version. The one where a wild wolf performed 17 cycles of a pattern meant to communicate across species, where she led a human 4 miles through darkness to save everyone involved, where she approached close enough to touch twice and chose trust over every evolutionary instinct that said humans were danger. Some people believed her. Most nodded politely and changed the subject. A few asked if she'd considered talking to someone, the implication being that isolation and stress could play tricks on perception. Sarah didn't argue. She'd stopped needing other people to understand. She kept one other item from that November night, a tuft of grey fur, sealed in a small glass vial, collected from the cage where the male wolf had been imprisoned. She carried it in her pocket during every patrol, a reminder that impossible things happened when you were brave enough to witness them. On the anniversary, Sarah hiked to the outcrop one last time. Snow was falling, the first of the season, covering the forest in fresh silence. She sat on the flat rock and watched the light fade from the sky, not expecting anything, just needing to mark the day somehow. That's when she heard it, a howl, distant, maybe 2 ridges over, then another, closer, and another, until the forest was filled with wolf song, the kind of coordinated vocalization that researchers call a chorus howl, used to reinforce pack bonds and announce territory. Sarah stood without thinking, her heart in her throat. The howling continued for 3 minutes, layered and complex, and in that sound she heard everything language couldn't capture. Survival, family, the wild intelligence that moved through these mountains long before humans arrived and would remain long after they left. When the howling stopped, the silence felt alive. Sarah waited, barely breathing, scanning the darkening forest. No wolves appeared, but something had shifted in the air, something she felt in her bones, an acknowledgement maybe, a goodbye, or perhaps just a reminder that the forest held mysteries deeper than understanding, and that sometimes the greatest gift was simply knowing you'd touched one. She descended the mountain as full darkness fell, her flashlight beam picking out familiar trail markers. Behind her, the forest settled into night. And somewhere in that vast wilderness, a wolf family moved through shadows, teaching their young the same lesson their mother had learned. That courage sometimes means trusting the impossible. That kindness can cross every divide we think exists. That we're never as alone in this world as we believe. If you've witnessed something like this, if you believe animals remember kindness, write in the comments. Share your own experience with animal intelligence below. Sarah Mackenzie still works at Mount Hood National Forest. She still hikes to that outcrop, though less frequently now, and she still carries the vial of wolf fur, still looks at the photograph above her desk, still remembers the moment when amber eyes met hers and asked for trust to cross every boundary that said it shouldn't be possible. She never stops believing what she witnessed, because some truths live in the body, in the shiver of recognition when 2 different kinds of intelligence meet and understand each other perfectly. No textbook can contain that. No study can replicate it, but it happened. And it changed everything Sarah thought she knew about the forest, about wolves, about the invisible threads that connect all living things when we're brave enough to see them. The world is wider and stranger and more beautiful than we imagine. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it shows us proof.